Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game So taking on a fun and random episode, guys, this evening as we are playing the re-released 1.0C patch of Mortal Kombat Arcade Edition on the Sega Genesis from Linkuei and BillyTimeGames. And if you remember Mortal Kombat back in the day, the arcade version of the game was extremely impressive, and even though the Sega Genesis version of the port could definitely hold its own, it was nowhere near the arcade accuracy that you would want. Thankfully, Linkuei and BillyTimeGames came in and basically remade the entirety of Mortal Kombat from the ground up on Sega Genesis, giving us the de facto best way to play on a Sega console of that generation. Before we get too far involved, though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But there's so many different improvements, changes, and rebuilds to this version of the game, it is almost impossible to catalog every single one of them in a single video. And basically the entirety of this title has been reworked, from the animations and stage art in the background to the overall sprites being improved. Every single aspect of Mortal Kombat has been touched by the modders' hands to make it a better experience. And I would say the best part so far is it feels more responsive compared to the Sega Genesis original. There seems to always have been a little bit of a delay or lag when I would play that game, and I don't feel it here whatsoever. And that is always absolutely awesome. Now I know before you go down in the comments you're wondering to yourself, why does it matter? We can play the arcade version of Mortal Kombat pretty much anywhere. And that is absolutely true, but there's a ton of nostalgia for Mortal Kombat, especially on Sega Genesis, because back in the day, the schoolyard argument, Super Nintendo versus Sega, people pointed to Mortal Kombat as one of the games which is better. Not only did it perform better, but it also had all of the violence of the arcade original, so pretty much everyone back in the day probably played this game a ton on a home console, Sega being the de facto best way to play. And you will see here, it is just looking so much better than it ever has before, and I will do some direct comparisons between the arcade version as well, so you can kind of see what they look like side by side later on in the video. But again, I just love projects like this, taking a title that everyone knows and improving it just because people can. BillyTimeGames and Linkuei are doing a lot of this stuff. There's a few other people that were involved in the mod as well. I will leave their name in the description below because some of the pronunciations I'm not quite sure on. As we move further into the game, this is just the type of stuff that I've loved to see in retro modding. For every new indie game we get on an old console, there's somebody out there taking what we love and remember and just making it that much better for us. This is just such a better version of the game when you're actually playing it. Now, of course, it is still the original Mortal Kombat, and I would consider that the weakest in the first three games. Mortal Kombat 2 definitely upped the value a lot on what this title could actually do and what the fighting game engine could provide. And honestly, when we talk about Mortal Kombat from a historical context, this game just absolutely blew up in arcades and made everyone thirsty and lustful for these violent 2D fighters, and it is no different today. It's still a huge genre and still a huge franchise that gets entries in that people absolutely love to play. And as we kind of move through as well, what you can't hear right now, but you will hear when I give you the sound sample, is over 80 different samples from the arcade board have been brought over to the Sega Genesis version of the game. And honestly, back in the day, the ROM cartridges it shipped on was too small to really accommodate for that. Definitely trying to save a little money and up the profit margins. So the modders have put a lot of those voice samples back into the Sega Genesis version, and so much of what Mortal Kombat truly is the overall sound. But even on the stage here, the parallax scrolling background with all of the clouds, everything just looks better in the arcade edition of the game. And with the 1.0C update, you get new controller options as well as just a buttoned up experience. And that's what Mortal Kombat fans deserve. This is the type of game, sure you could go out and buy an arcade board and sure you could play it in MAME, but if you remember it from Sega Genesis, you want to play that copy again and get the nostalgia factor going. So games like this and mods like this allow you to have that nostalgic fun while also just having a much better version of the game. And they put basically every single option they can possibly think of into this mod. You get a dip switch setting menu, kind of like you would see on an arcade board, but different of course. And you have so many different options to articulate here. The different character select screens, the different backgrounds you can start the fight on, whether or not the CPU will always do a fatality. You basically get to make the most granular experience out of Mortal Kombat and Sega Genesis you ever could, giving you the ultimate freedom to make the game however you want it. But here comes that sound sample. Listen for some of the arcade sound clips as well. 45 seconds, I'll be right back to tell you more about the mod and why I love it.
Sonya wins. Sonya wins.
Probably the best sound you're ever going to get on Mortal Kombat on the Sega Genesis version of the game, and these additional animations here on the courtyard sequence were stuff that we never got on Sega Genesis, and even though this can't stand up to the arcade original, it gets very close in both the overall graphical capabilities as well as the theming. But let's move over to the arcade original version here. You will see those monks in the background, you'll see everything going on here, and it is the exact same appearance. Sure, the arcade graphics are better because that board was way more powerful than a Sega Genesis ever could be, but the overall intent in the image comes across, and that's something that was missing from the Sega Genesis version of the game. There was a lot of cuts to the backgrounds that basically made it feel kind of like a lifeless experience. As we move back to the Genesis again, you're going to see just how much is going on screen at once, and that does make a big difference. It feels like a more fully fleshed out world of Mortal Kombat, the one that you remember from arcades, just brought over onto the Sega Genesis. But the one thing that you really can't see in the footage, you just have to take me at my word until you play it, is all of the timing improvements that have come over as well. This game just controls and feels more fluid than it ever has before. And honestly, it's not like Mortal Kombat is the most fluid 2D fighting game. Stuff like Street Fighter, King of Fighters, all of those are definitely going to beat it in the performance department. But it is better here on Sega Genesis. And before you go down into the comments, no, I don't dislike Mortal Kombat. I'm just saying it was their first game and it was a little bit rough around the edges. As we move back over to the arcade version again to show you the differences, you can tell that obviously this is better looking, but it still has all of the graphics persisting on Sega Genesis that it would in the arcade version of the ROM, and that really is a fun time. And again, before you wonder why people spend the time to do these things, just be happy they exist. I love when modders come into a classic game and just improve it the way they wanted to have it when it released, because I'm sure a lot of these mods are predicated on the fact that people were slightly disappointed when they'd bring something like Mortal Kombat home and realize that even if it was the same game, it didn't have the exact same vibes as the arcade. And that was really the difference in ports back in the day. Yes, it was the same title, yes, the same characters were there, the music was pretty similar, but you knew you were getting an inferior version of the game compared to the arcade original. And when this port did come out on Sega Genesis, it was definitely rushed and dropped a lot of things that could have been done had they had more time. But Mortal Kombat was such an absolute hit in arcades. Every single console wanted its own port, and they wanted to strike when the iron's hot. As we move back over to the arcade original, you will see that the sprites are bigger, they're a little bit more impressive, but otherwise it is the same game. And the best part is all of the ending screens and character biographies from the arcade version, the modders have taken the artwork from the arcade version and imported it into the Sega Genesis version, so you're basically getting parody on all of the artwork like you saw off the top when you saw Goro in the intro to the video, and that is always a fun time. Sure, the Mortal Kombat Arcade Edition on Sega Genesis is never going to be the arcade original version, but it gets pretty damn close, and that is a ton of fun. Even some of the stages here have been recolored in the palette to be more accurate to the arcade originals. But this is what I love about fan games and modders. They can basically do anything they want, they can mod to their heart's content, and sometimes you get stuff like Mortal Kombat Arcade Edition, a basic rebuild of the entire engine and overall graphical capabilities of Mortal Kombat, giving you the closest arcade version on a home port you can get on the Sega Genesis. And that's definitely nothing to complain about. But leave me a comment down below and tell me, what system did you have Mortal Kombat for back in the day? I definitely had the Sega Genesis version. I had Genesis, not Super Nintendo, for a while, and I remember those schoolyard arguments. I would always say, well, at least we still have fatalities, and that 100% was the truth. And now with the arcade edition, we have fatalities plus a much better game. Short of that, we are done. I will leave a link to the patch below. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.